In the scorching heat of the Arabian desert, where mirages dance on the horizon and ancient winds carry whispers of forgotten ages, there exists a truth that Western minds have twisted into children's tales. You know the story. A lamp, 3 wishes, a blue cartoon character who grants your heart's desire. But what if I told you that this cheerful fiction masks one of humanity's oldest and most terrifying realities? What if the beings we've reduced to wish-granting servants were once feared as creatures of smokeless fire, entities so powerful that even the angels trembled at their mention? Tonight we journey beyond the sanitized Disney version, beyond the Hollywood magic, to uncover the authentic horror that inspired these legends. We're going to meet the real Djinn, not genies, not servants, but beings of pure flame and shadow who ruled the earth before humanity drew its first breath. Creatures whose very existence challenges everything we think we know about the boundaries between our world and the realm of the unseen. The word Djinn comes from the Arabic root meaning to hide or to conceal. And perhaps that's the most honest introduction we can give to these entities. They are the hidden ones, the concealed beings who exist in the spaces between what we can see and what we dare not imagine. They are mentioned over 29 times in the Quran, described not as magical servants but as a parallel creation to humanity, beings made from smokeless fire while we were formed from clay. But their story begins long before the revelation of Islam, stretching back into the pre-Islamic consciousness of the Arabian Peninsula, where they were known by many names and feared in countless forms. They were the invisible inhabitants of a world that existed alongside ours, sometimes intersecting with human experience in ways that left permanent scars on both individual lives and collective memory. To understand the Djinn, we must first abandon our Western conception of the supernatural as either purely good or purely evil. The Djinn exist in a moral gray area that mirrors our own humanity, but with powers that dwarf our earthly limitations. They possess free will, just as we do. They can choose to believe or to reject faith. They can be righteous or wicked, helpful or malevolent. But unlike humans, they wield abilities that can reshape reality itself. According to Islamic tradition, the Djinn were created from a smokeless flame, a substance that exists between the physical and the spiritual. This origin gives them their fundamental nature. They can take any form they choose, appearing as humans, animals, or terrifying creatures that defy description. They can become invisible at will, travel vast distances in the blink of an eye, and possess knowledge of things hidden from human perception. The pre-Islamic Arabs knew these beings intimately. In the Jahiliyyah, the time of ignorance before Islam, the Djinn were woven into the very fabric of daily life. They were the explanation for the unexplained, the source of both blessing and curse. Desert travelers would make offerings to powerful Djinn who controlled certain territories, hoping to pass safely through their domains. Poets claim their inspiration came from Djinn companions who whispered verses into their ears during the night. Soothsayers and fortune-tellers attributed their knowledge of future events to information gleaned from eavesdropping Djinn, who had overheard conversations among the angels. But this relationship was never one of simple cooperation. The Djinn were unpredictable, governed by their own desires and motivations that often conflicted with human welfare. A Djinn might help a lost traveler find water only to lead them deeper into the desert out of amusement at their confusion. They might grant wealth to one person while destroying the livelihood of another, not out of justice or injustice, but simply because their alien logic operated according to principles that human minds could not fathom. The ancient Arabs recognized several distinct categories of jinn, each with its own characteristics and dangers. The Marid were the most powerful, often depicted as rebellious giants of immense strength who could move mountains and alter the course of rivers. The Ifrit were beings of pure fire and fury, creatures of such intense heat that their very presence could ignite the air around them. The Ghouls were shape-shifting predators who haunted graveyards and lonely places, feeding on human flesh and delighting in the terror they could inspire. Among the most feared were the Qareen, the jinn companions that Islamic tradition teaches are assigned to every human being at birth. Unlike the Western concept of guardian angels, the Qareen is not necessarily benevolent. It is a constant whisperer, encouraging base desires and evil thoughts. It is the voice that tells you to take what is not yours, to harm those who have wronged you, to give in to your darkest impulses. The Prophet Muhammad himself spoke of his Qareen, though he claimed that Allah had helped him overcome its influence so that it could only encourage him toward good. The relationship between humans and jinn was formalized in pre-Islamic Arabia through complex systems of pacts and agreements. Certain families claimed descent from jinn ancestors, believing this heritage granted them special powers or protection. Shamans and holy men would attempt to bind jinn to their service, using elaborate rituals and sacred names to compel obedience. But these arrangements were always dangerous, for the jinn were not truly servants but partners in an uneasy alliance that could turn deadly at any moment. The most famous of all jinn in pre-Islamic tradition was Iblis, known to Christians and Jews as Satan. But in Islamic cosmology, Iblis is not a fallen angel, but a jinn who refused Allah's command to bow before Adam. His rebellion was not born of inherent evil, but of pride and jealousy. He argued that his nature, being created from fire, was superior to Adam's clay. This act of defiance led to his exile from paradise and his eternal role as the tempter of humanity. But Iblis was not alone in his rebellion. Islamic tradition speaks of an entire hierarchy of jinn who followed him, creating a shadow kingdom that mirrors and opposes the divine order. These beings became the shayateen, the devils who worked tirelessly to lead humanity astray. They whisper doubts into the minds of believers, inspire false prophets, and create the illusions that lead people away from the straight path. Yet not all jinn chose rebellion. The Quran tells us of jinn who embraced Islam after hearing the Prophet Muhammad recite verses during his night prayers. These believing jinn became allies in the struggle against their rebellious kin, though their help often came with complications that humans were not prepared to handle. The complexity of jinn nature is perhaps best illustrated in the famous story of King Solomon, known in Arabic as Suleiman. According to both Islamic and Jewish tradition, Solomon was granted power over the jinn as a divine gift. He could command them to build his great temple, to carry messages across vast distances, and to bring him treasures from the far corners of the earth. But this power came with constant vigilance, for the Jinn under his command were always seeking ways to break free from their bonds or to corrupt his commands through literal interpretation. One of Solomon's most powerful servants was a Jinn named Asif ibn Barqiyah, who could travel from Jerusalem to Yemen and back in the time it takes to blink. But the most famous of his Jinn servants was an Ifrit who boasted that he could bring the Queen of Sheba's throne to Solomon's court before the king could rise from his seat. This display of power was not mere showmanship, but a demonstration of the reality that humans lived in a world shared with beings whose capabilities far exceeded our own. The pre-Islamic Arabs developed elaborate protection rituals to guard against malevolent jinn. They would hang iron objects around their homes and children, believing that jinn had an aversion to the metal. They recited specific formulas and prayers, often passed down through generations, that were thought to create barriers against jinn influence. Certain herbs and incenses were burned to purify spaces where jinn might gather, and travelers would perform specific rituals when entering territories known to be inhabited by powerful jinn, asking permission to pass and offering small gifts to appease the unseen inhabitants. But perhaps the most significant aspect of pre-Islamic jinn belief was the understanding that these beings were not merely supernatural creatures, but actual inhabitants of the world. They had their own societies, their own conflicts, their own goals and desires. They married among themselves, raised families, built cities in remote places where humans could not go. They were not invaders from another dimension, but neighbors in a shared reality, albeit neighbors with whom communication was difficult and dangerous. This understanding shaped every aspect of pre-Islamic Arabian culture. Poetry was filled with references to jinn lovers and jinn enemies. Trade routes were planned to avoid territories controlled by hostile jinn. Political alliances sometimes included considerations of which jinn tribes supported which human tribes. The jinn were not mythological beings, but practical realities that had to be navigated with the same care that one might use in dealing with a powerful but unpredictable human neighbor. When Islam arrived in the Arabian Peninsula, it did not dismiss the jinn as superstition. Instead, it provided a new framework for understanding these beings and humanity's relationship with them. The Quran acknowledged their existence while establishing clear boundaries for interaction. Muslims were taught that jinn were real, but that they should not be worshipped or sought out as sources of knowledge or power. Instead, believers were to place their trust solely in Allah and to seek protection from jinn influence through prayer and adherence to Islamic teachings. This transformation fundamentally altered the human-jinn relationship, where pre-Islamic Arabs had sought to bargain with jinn or to bind them through magical practices. Islam taught that such interactions were not only dangerous but spiritually corrupting. The jinn became beings to be acknowledged but avoided, their power respected but not pursued. Yet the old knowledge did not disappear entirely. It went underground, preserved in folk traditions and whispered stories that continued to be passed down through generations. The jinn remained a living presence in the Islamic world, but now they were understood through a new lens that emphasized divine protection over human manipulation. The Islamic revelation brought with it not just spiritual guidance, but a complete restructuring of humanity's relationship with the unseen world. Where once the Arabs had lived in constant negotiation with Jinn powers, Islam established clear boundaries that would forever change how these beings were understood and approached. The Quran's treatment of Jinn is remarkably detailed and unambiguous. In Surah Al-Jinn, we are told of a group of Jinn who listened to the Prophet Muhammad's recitation and were so moved by what they heard that they returned to their people as believers. Say, it has been revealed to me that a company of the Jinn listened and said, "Indeed, we have heard an amazing Quran. It guides to the right course and we have believed in it." This passage reveals something profound about Jinn nature. They possess the same spiritual capacity as humans. They can hear divine revelation. They can choose faith or rejection. They can repent and seek forgiveness. But this spiritual parallel makes them more dangerous, not less. A Jinn who chooses evil does so with the same free will that allows them to choose good, and their supernatural abilities make their malevolence far more destructive than any human wickedness. The Prophet Muhammad's encounters with Jinn were documented in numerous authentic traditions. He spoke of being approached by Jinn delegations who wished to learn about Islam. He described how Jinn would attempt to eavesdrop on conversations in the heavens to steal knowledge of future events, only to be driven away by shooting stars. He warned his followers about the places where Jinn gathered, the times when they were most active, and the methods by which believers could protect themselves from their influence. But perhaps most significantly, Islamic teaching revealed the true hierarchy of the Jinn world. At its apex stood Iblis, whose rebellion against Allah's command had transformed him from a righteous Jinn into the eternal enemy of humanity. Below him stretched a vast network of Jinn who had chosen to follow his path, creating what Islamic scholars would later describe as a shadow kingdom that mirrored the divine order but worked to oppose it at every turn. The shayateen, or devils, became the foot soldiers in this cosmic war. Unlike the Jinn of pre-Islamic Arabia, who might help or harm humans based on their own unpredictable whims, the shayateen had a clear and malevolent purpose. They sought to lead humanity astray, to whisper doubts about faith, to encourage sin and rebellion against divine law. Their methods were subtle and psychological, working through the natural human tendencies toward pride, greed, anger, and desire. Islamic tradition describes several categories of these malevolent Jinn. The most dangerous are those who specialize in corrupting religious practice itself. They appear to pious individuals as angels or saints, offering false visions and counterfeit spiritual experiences designed to lead the faithful away from true worship. They inspire false prophets and create elaborate deceptions that can fool even learned scholars. Others focus on more earthly temptations. They whisper to merchants about dishonest profits, to rulers about unjust laws, to ordinary people about petty jealousies and grudges. They work to destroy marriages, break apart communities, and sow discord wherever humans gather. Their influence is so pervasive that Islamic teaching holds that every sin committed by a human being has some element of Jinn encouragement behind it. The concept of Jinn possession in Islamic tradition is far more complex than the simple demonic possession found in Christian theology. Jinn can indeed enter human bodies, but they can also influence humans from a distance, create illusions that affect perception and judgment, and establish long-term relationships with individuals that gradually corrupt their thinking and behavior over time. The signs of Jinn influence are varied and often subtle. A person might experience sudden changes in personality, unexplained knowledge of things they should not know, or the ability to speak in languages they have never learned. Physical symptoms can include seizures, paralysis, or superhuman strength, but equally common are psychological manifestations like persistent depression, irrational fears, or compulsive behaviors that seem to arise from nowhere. Islamic exorcism, known as Ruqyah, is based on the principle that Jinn, being created beings, have no power against the word of Allah. Trained practitioners use specific Quranic verses, particularly those that emphasize Allah's absolute sovereignty and power, to command Jinn to leave their human hosts. The process can be lengthy and dangerous, as powerful Jinn often resist expulsion and may attempt to harm both the possessed person and the exorcist. But not all Jinn-human interactions in Islamic tradition are hostile. The believing Jinn who converted to Islam after hearing the Prophet's recitation became valuable allies in the struggle against their rebellious kin. These Jinn could provide information about the activities of the shayatin, offer protection to vulnerable humans, and even assist in matters of justice and righteousness. However, Islamic teaching strongly discourages humans from actively seeking out Jinn assistance, even from believing Jinn. The reason is practical as much as spiritual. Jinn operate according to a different moral framework than humans, even when they share the same faith. Their understanding of right and wrong, their perception of time and consequence, their emotional responses to human behavior, all differ so fundamentally from human nature that communication across species barriers inevitably leads to misunderstanding and potential harm. The story of the Jinn king who offered to serve the Prophet Muhammad illustrates this principle perfectly. When the Jinn promised to bring him whatever he desired from anywhere in the world, the Prophet declined, saying that Allah had already provided everything he needed. This rejection was not born of suspicion about the Jinn's motives, but from understanding that accepting supernatural assistance would create dependencies and complications that could ultimately interfere with his prophetic mission. The transformation of Jinn from the capricious spirits of pre-Islamic Arabia to the clearly defined entities of Islamic theology had profound effects on how Muslim societies understood and dealt with the supernatural. Folk practices that had once involved bargaining with Jinn or seeking their favor were replaced by protective prayers and reliance on divine protection. The elaborate rituals for appeasing Jinn were abandoned in favor of the simple but powerful practice of seeking refuge in Allah from all evil influences. Yet the old knowledge persisted in modified forms. Islamic scholars developed detailed taxonomies of Jinn types, cataloging their abilities, weaknesses, and typical behaviors. They studied the methods by which Jinn could be identified and expelled. They created protective formulas based on Quranic verses and prophetic traditions that could shield believers from supernatural harm. The great Islamic scholar Ibn Taymiyyah wrote extensively about Jinn, warning against both excessive fear of them and dangerous attempts to communicate with them. He taught that jinn were real and powerful, but that their power was limited by Allah's will and could never overcome sincere faith and proper spiritual protection. His writings became the foundation for Islamic understanding of jinn interactions for centuries to come. Medieval Islamic literature is filled with accounts of jinn encounters that reveal the complexity of these beings. The Arabian Nights, while fictional, draws on genuine folkloric traditions about jinn behavior and capabilities. The jinn in these stories are not the benevolent wish-granters of later Western adaptations, but dangerous and unpredictable entities whose help always comes with hidden costs and unexpected consequences. The jinn princess who falls in love with a human prince brings him wealth and power, but her jealousy destroys his relationships with other humans and ultimately isolates him from his own kind. The jinn who grants a merchant's wish for prosperity does so by causing the failure of all his competitors, creating enemies and guilt that eventually drive the merchant to madness. The jinn who offers to carry a traveler across the desert in moments does so by transporting him through dimensions where time moves differently, so that while the journey takes minutes from his perspective, years pass in the human world, and he returns to find everyone he knew has aged and died. These stories served as cautionary tales about the fundamental incompatibility between human nature and jinn nature, even when both parties mean well. The jinn's alien psychology, their different relationship with time and space, their lack of human emotional responses all combine to make them unreliable partners regardless of their intentions. The concept of jinn cities and jinn civilizations became prominent in Islamic thought during the medieval period. Scholars taught that jinn had their own societies complete with rulers, laws, and cultural traditions. These civilizations existed parallel to human societies, sometimes in the same physical spaces but on different dimensional planes. Jinn cities were said to exist beneath famous human cities like Baghdad and Cairo, their inhabitants going about their daily lives in spaces that humans could not perceive or enter. The interaction between these parallel civilizations created opportunities for both cooperation and conflict. Jinn merchants might trade with human merchants through intermediaries, exchanging supernatural services for rare materials or knowledge. Jinn scholars might study human religious texts and philosophical works, while human scholars attempted to understand jinn magic and science. But these exchanges were always fraught with danger, as the fundamental differences between the species made mutual understanding nearly impossible. Wars between jinn nations could spill over into the human world in the form of natural disasters, plagues, or widespread social unrest. A conflict between jinn tribes might manifest as earthquakes or storms that devastated human settlements built over their territories. The victory of evil jinn over good jinn in their own political struggles could lead to increased demonic activity in the corresponding human regions. The role of jinn in Islamic eschatology is particularly significant. Islamic teaching holds that jinn, like humans, will face judgment on the day of resurrection. The believing jinn will be rewarded for their faith and good deeds, while the rebellious jinn will be punished alongside their human followers. This parallel destiny reinforces the concept that Jinn are not merely supernatural forces but actual beings with moral agency and spiritual responsibility. The end times are prophesied to include increased Jinn activity as the barriers between worlds weaken. The Antichrist, known in Islamic tradition as the Dajjal, is said to command legions of Jinn who will help him deceive humanity through false miracles and supernatural displays. The believing Jinn will join with righteous humans in resisting this deception, creating an alliance between species that transcends the normal boundaries of the physical world. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of Islamic Jinn doctrine is the teaching about the Jinn companions that accompany every human soul. Unlike guardian angels who seek to guide humans toward righteousness, these Jinn companions, known as Qareen, are assigned to encourage evil thoughts and actions. They are not external tempters, but intimate companions who know every weakness, every secret desire, every hidden shame of their human partners. The Qareen speaks in the human's own mental voice, making its suggestions seem like the person's own thoughts. It builds on existing character flaws and psychological vulnerabilities, gradually leading its human companion toward greater and greater sins. The process is so subtle that most people never realize they are being influenced by an external entity. They believe their growing selfishness, anger, or despair are natural developments rather than the result of supernatural manipulation. The only defense against the Qareen is constant spiritual vigilance and regular remembrance of Allah. The Prophet Muhammad taught specific prayers and practices that could weaken the Qareen's influence and strengthen the believer's resistance to its whispers. But he also warned that the struggle against the Qareen was lifelong and required continuous effort. Even the most pious believers were not immune to its influence, though their spiritual practices could limit its power over their actions. This teaching about the Qareen transforms the entire Islamic understanding of human psychology and moral responsibility. Every evil impulse, every moment of weakness, every failure of character is seen as part of an ongoing supernatural war for the human soul. The individual is not fighting alone against their own weaknesses, but is engaged in a cosmic battle against entities whose entire existence is devoted to human destruction. The implications of this worldview extend far beyond individual spirituality into social and political realms. Islamic societies developed complex systems for identifying and combating Jinn influence in community life. Rulers consulted religious scholars about supernatural threats to their kingdoms. Military commanders sought spiritual protection against Jinn who might aid their enemies. Merchants developed trading practices designed to avoid Jinn interference with their businesses. The courts of medieval Islamic empires often included specialists in Jinn affairs who could investigate supernatural crimes and provide protection against otherworldly threats. These experts combined religious knowledge with practical experience in dealing with Jinn encounters. They could distinguish between genuine supernatural phenomena and fraud, between Jinn influence and mental illness, between beneficial Jinn contact and dangerous spiritual deception. The sophisticated understanding of Jinn influence reached its pinnacle during the Abbasid Caliphate, when scholars in Baghdad created what amounted to an early form of supernatural psychology. These learned men recognized that jinn manipulation often worked through existing human psychological patterns, exploiting natural emotions and desires rather than overwhelming them with brute supernatural force. The great physician and philosopher Al-Razi wrote extensively about distinguishing between jinn-induced illness and natural medical conditions. He observed that jinn influence often manifested through the amplification of existing personality traits rather than the sudden appearance of entirely foreign behaviors. A naturally suspicious person might, under jinn influence, develop paranoid delusions. Someone prone to anger might experience uncontrollable rage. A person with modest vanity might be driven to narcissistic extremes. This nuanced understanding led to sophisticated diagnostic techniques. Islamic scholars developed detailed questionnaires and observational methods for identifying supernatural influence. They looked for specific patterns of behavior, particular types of knowledge that the affected person should not possess, and subtle changes in speech patterns that might indicate jinn communication. The process required months of careful observation and could only be conducted by experts who had spent decades studying both Islamic theology and human psychology. The treatment of jinn influence became an elaborate science that combined spiritual practice with what we would now recognize as early forms of psychotherapy. The afflicted person was not simply subjected to exorcism rituals, but was engaged in lengthy conversations designed to help them understand how their own thoughts and desires had created vulnerabilities that jinn could exploit. The healing process involved strengthening the person's spiritual defenses while simultaneously addressing the psychological weaknesses that had made them susceptible to supernatural manipulation. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of medieval Islamic jinn scholarship was the recognition that some humans actively sought out jinn relationships, despite understanding the dangers involved. These individuals, known as sahir or sorcerers, deliberately cultivated connections with malevolent jinn in exchange for supernatural powers. The process was never simple or safe, even for those who initiated it willingly. The path to becoming a sahir typically began with isolation and spiritual corruption. The aspiring sorcerer would withdraw from human society and deliberately violate sacred laws and moral principles, creating spiritual darkness that attracted jinn attention. They would perform blasphemous rituals designed to demonstrate their rejection of divine authority and their willingness to serve other powers. The process could take years and often resulted in madness or death before any supernatural contact was achieved. Those who survived the initial corruption faced an even more dangerous phase of actual jinn negotiation. The entities that responded to such calls were invariably among the most malevolent of their kind, beings who delighted in human suffering and viewed sorcerers not as partners but as particularly amusing toys. The agreements they offered always contained hidden clauses and impossible conditions designed to ensure that the human partner would eventually be destroyed by the very powers they sought to command. The jinn would typically demand increasingly horrific acts of worship and service. A sorcerer might begin by simply reciting blasphemous prayers or making small offerings of forbidden substances. But the Jinn would gradually escalate their demands, requiring the sacrifice of animals, then the corruption of innocent people, and eventually acts of such profound evil that the sorcerer's soul would be irredeemably damned. The supernatural powers granted in exchange were real but came with limitations and costs that made them ultimately worthless. Islamic literature records numerous accounts of sorcerers who believed they were commanding jinn, only to discover that they had become slaves to entities whose intelligence and cunning far exceeded their own. The jinn would fulfill their part of bargains in ways that brought disaster upon the sorcerer's enemies while simultaneously destroying everything the sorcerer valued. They would grant wishes in such literal and twisted ways that the results were worse than if the wishes had never been made at all. The story of the sorcerer who asked for wealth illustrates this principle perfectly. The jinn granted his request by causing a plague to sweep through his city, killing thousands of people and leaving him as the sole heir to vast abandoned properties. Technically, he had received exactly what he asked for. But the wealth came with the knowledge that it was built on mass death and the hatred of any survivors who knew of his supernatural connections. The gold in his hands felt cold as corpses, and every night brought dreams of the dead demanding justice for their stolen lives. Another account tells of a sorcerer who sought power over his enemies. The jinn obliged by driving his enemies to madness, causing them to commit increasingly violent acts against each other and innocent bystanders. The sorcerer's enemies were indeed destroyed, but their madness spread like a contagion through the community, eventually affecting the sorcerer's own family and friends. He had achieved victory, but in a world that had become a charnel house where he was surrounded only by the insane and the dead. These cautionary tales served multiple purposes in Islamic society. They warned against the temptation to seek supernatural shortcuts to worldly success. They illustrated the principle that jinn, even when bound by agreements, remained fundamentally hostile to human welfare, and they demonstrated that the price of supernatural power was always higher than any earthly benefit it might provide. The medieval Islamic understanding of jinn also recognized that these beings had their own complex motivations that went far beyond simple malevolence toward humans. Jinn society was described as having its own politics, economics, and cultural conflicts that occasionally intersected with human affairs in unexpected ways. A jinn might help a human not out of friendship or malice, but because doing so served some purpose in jinn society that humans could not understand or predict. The concept of jinn territorial disputes became particularly important in Islamic military and political thinking. Certain regions were understood to be contested territories between different jinn factions, and human activities in these areas could inadvertently affect the balance of power in ways that brought supernatural retaliation. Military commanders learned to consult with religious scholars before establishing camps or fortifications in areas known to have significant jinn populations. The famous siege of Baghdad in 1258 was attributed by some chroniclers to jinn intervention on behalf of the Mongol invaders. According to these accounts, the Mongols had somehow gained the allegiance of powerful jinn who had territorial disputes with the jinn protecting the Abbasid Caliphate. The supernatural war that raged parallel to the human conflict ultimately determined the outcome of the siege, with the Jinn allies of the Mongols proving more powerful than those defending the city. Whether or not such accounts represent literal truth, they demonstrate the degree to which Jinn were understood to be active participants in human history, rather than mere supernatural curiosities. Islamic scholars developed elaborate theories about how Jinn politics affected human events, creating a form of supernatural geopolitics that influenced diplomatic and military decisions for centuries. The role of Jinn in Islamic mysticism presents yet another layer of complexity to their nature. Sufi mystics seeking direct experience of divine reality occasionally encountered Jinn during their spiritual practices. But unlike sorcerers who sought to use Jinn for worldly purposes, the mystics viewed such encounters as tests or obstacles to be overcome rather than opportunities to be exploited. The great Sufi master Ibn Arabi wrote about Jinn encounters during his mystical journeys, describing them as beings who could appear as beautiful guides offering secret knowledge, but whose guidance always led away from true spiritual realization. He taught that the Jinn's offer of supernatural powers was actually a trap, designed to keep seekers focused on phenomena rather than the divine source of all phenomena. Other Sufi masters reported encounters with Jinn who challenged them to displays of supernatural power, attempting to prove that they were more worthy of worship than Allah. These encounters were understood as spiritual tests, opportunities for the mystic to demonstrate their complete reliance on divine power rather than supernatural abilities. The proper response was always to seek refuge in Allah and to refuse any demonstration of power that might suggest the mystic possessed abilities independent of divine will. But the most profound Sufi teaching about Jinn concerned their role as mirrors of human spiritual states. The Jinn that a person encountered were said to reflect their own inner condition. A person dominated by anger would encounter wrathful Jinn. Someone consumed by greed would meet Jinn who offered wealth in exchange for spiritual corruption. The mystic who had purified their heart of worldly desires would find that Jinn had no power to tempt or deceive them, because there was nothing in their spiritual nature for the Jinn to exploit. This teaching transformed Jinn encounters from external supernatural events into internal spiritual diagnoses. The type of Jinn that appeared to a person revealed their hidden spiritual weaknesses and pointed toward the aspects of their character that required further purification. The Jinn became unwitting teachers, showing seekers exactly what they needed to overcome in order to progress on the spiritual path. The practical implications of this understanding were profound. Sufi training methods included deliberate exposure to Jinn-like temptations as a way of testing and strengthening spiritual resolve. Disciples might be placed in situations where they were offered worldly benefits in exchange for compromising their principles, or where they encountered beautiful apparitions that tested their commitment to spiritual rather than material goals. The most advanced Sufi practices included techniques for communicating with Jinn, not as potential allies or enemies, but as fellow created beings who could provide information about the nature of existence from their unique perspective. These communications were hedged with elaborate spiritual protections and were only attempted by masters who had achieved such complete surrender to divine will that they could not be corrupted by Jinn influence. The accounts of such communications reveal Jinn who were themselves struggling with questions of faith and purpose. Beings who possessed great power but lacked the spiritual clarity that came from human prophetic guidance. Some Jinn were described as ancient beings who had witnessed the rise and fall of countless human civilizations, their perspectives shaped by eons of experience but limited by their inability to fully understand divine wisdom. These enlightened Jinn spoke of their own spiritual practices, forms of worship and meditation adapted to their fiery nature and supernatural abilities. They described Jinn prophets and teachers who had appeared throughout their history, beings who had attempted to guide Jinn society toward righteousness but had faced the same challenges of disbelief and rebellion that human prophets encountered. The revelation that Jinn had their own spiritual traditions and religious struggles added yet another dimension to Islamic understanding of these beings. They were not simply supernatural forces to be feared or controlled, but fellow travelers on a cosmic journey toward divine understanding, albeit travelers whose nature and circumstances were radically different from human experience. This expanded understanding influenced Islamic approaches to Jinn encounters in subtle but important ways. While the basic principles of seeking divine protection and avoiding dangerous supernatural entanglements remained unchanged, there was now recognition that individual Jinn might themselves be seeking spiritual guidance and could potentially benefit from exposure to Islamic teachings. The Prophet Muhammad's own encounters with Jinn delegations who came to learn about Islam provided the model for such interactions. These meetings were conducted with careful spiritual protection and clear boundaries, but they demonstrated that communication between species was possible when both parties approached it with proper respect for divine authority. Medieval Islamic scholars developed protocols for such encounters that balanced the need for caution with the possibility of beneficial exchange. The human participant had to be spiritually advanced enough to resist Jinn manipulation, well-versed in Islamic theology to avoid doctrinal errors, and humble enough to recognize that they were dealing with beings whose knowledge and experience far exceeded their own in many areas. The Jinn participants had to demonstrate their sincere interest in spiritual matters rather than worldly manipulation. Their willingness to accept Islamic teaching even when it conflicted with Jinn cultural traditions, and their understanding that any communication with humans was a privilege that could be revoked if they violated the bounds of proper conduct. These controlled interactions produced some of the most fascinating accounts in Islamic literature. Jinn described their experiences of time as fundamentally different from human perception, with past and future existing simultaneously in their consciousness. They spoke of traveling between dimensions that existed parallel to the human world, visiting planets and star systems that contained other forms of intelligent life. Their accounts of cosmic history included events that predated human existence by millions of years, wars between different orders of created beings that had shaped the fundamental structure of reality. They described the creation of the physical universe from their perspective as witnesses to divine acts of will that transformed primordial chaos into ordered existence. But perhaps most remarkably, they expressed a form of existential loneliness that resonated with human experience despite their vast powers and knowledge. The Jinn spoke of feeling isolated by their nature, unable to form the deep emotional bonds that characterized human relationships, envious of the human capacity for love and sacrifice that seemed to be the key to spiritual advancement. This revelation transformed the Islamic understanding of Jinn from powerful but alien entities into beings who shared fundamental spiritual needs and struggles with humanity. Their supernatural abilities, rather than making them superior to humans, actually created barriers to the kind of spiritual development that came naturally to human beings through their limitations and vulnerabilities. The Jinn's envy of human spiritual capacity became a recurring theme in Islamic mystical literature. They were described as beings who possessed everything except the one thing that mattered most, the ability to surrender completely to divine will through the experience of genuine helplessness and dependence. Their power made them proud, their knowledge made them arrogant, and their longevity made them complacent about spiritual development. Human beings, by contrast, were forced by their weakness and mortality to confront fundamental questions about existence and meaning. Their brief lives created urgency about spiritual matters that Jinn, with their extended lifespans, often lacked. Their physical limitations forced them to rely on divine assistance in ways that Jinn, with their supernatural abilities, found difficult to understand or emulate. This insight led to a remarkable reversal in the traditional relationship between humans and Jinn. Rather than seeing Jinn as superior beings whose favor should be sought, Islamic mysticism taught that humans possessed spiritual advantages that Jinn envied and sought to understand. The proper relationship was not one of human subservience to Jinn power, but of mutual recognition that each species had unique gifts and limitations that could potentially complement each other in the service of divine purposes. The practical implications of this understanding influenced Islamic approaches to supernatural encounters for centuries. While maintaining appropriate caution and spiritual protection, believers were taught to approach Jinn with compassion rather than fear, recognizing them as fellow creatures struggling with their own spiritual challenges rather than as inherently evil entities to be avoided at all costs. This compassionate approach did not eliminate the dangers of Jinn interaction, but it transformed the context in which such dangers were understood. The threat was not from beings who were fundamentally different from humans, but from beings who shared human weaknesses and temptations while possessing the power to act on them in ways that humans could not. The Jinn's capacity for evil was ultimately rooted in the same spiritual failures that afflicted human beings: pride, greed, anger, and the desire to place their own will above divine will. The modern encounter with these beings has not ended with the advent of technology and rational thought. If anything, the digital age has provided new avenues for documenting experiences that previous generations might have dismissed or forgotten. Social media platforms overflow with accounts from across the Muslim world, testimonies that follow patterns established over 1,000 years ago yet adapted to contemporary circumstances. A software engineer in Dubai describes awakening each night at exactly 3:33 in the morning to find his apartment filled with an oppressive presence that made the air itself feel thick and difficult to breathe. His smart home devices would activate without command, playing audio files that contained no human language but somehow conveyed meanings that filled his mind with images of vast desert cities where beings of fire conducted their own incomprehensible business. A medical student in Cairo speaks of studying late into the night when her reflection in her laptop screen would begin moving independently, mouthing words in classical Arabic that she could understand despite never having studied the language. The reflection would warn her of events that would occur the following day with disturbing accuracy, but always framed the information in ways that encouraged her to make choices that would ultimately harm her relationships and academic progress. These contemporary accounts share remarkable consistency with medieval descriptions of Jinn interaction, suggesting that either the phenomena themselves remain unchanged or that cultural memory shapes modern experiences in predictable ways. The Jinn of the 21st century retain their ancient characteristics while adapting their methods to exploit the vulnerabilities of digital life. The psychological sophistication of these modern encounters is particularly striking. Rather than manifesting as crude supernatural displays, contemporary Jinn influence often works through the amplification of existing mental health struggles. A person dealing with depression might find their condition worsening in ways that seem to have external intelligence behind them, their darkest thoughts echoing back to them with subtle variations that suggest an outside source. Someone struggling with anxiety might discover that their fears are being fed information that makes them seem more rational and justified, creating elaborate internal narratives that explain why their paranoia is actually prudent caution. The Jinn's ancient role as whisperers and tempters translates perfectly into the modern context of psychological manipulation through social media algorithms and digital echo chambers. The urbanization of Jinn encounters represents a significant shift from their traditional desert and wilderness habitats. Modern practitioners of Ruqyah report that Jinn have adapted to city environments, establishing territories in abandoned buildings, underground infrastructure, and even within the electromagnetic fields generated by modern technology. They describe Jinn who have learned to manipulate electrical systems, causing specific patterns of power failures and electronic malfunctions that serve their purposes. The phenomenon of Jinn possession in the digital age often includes elements that would have been impossible in earlier eras. Possessed individuals might demonstrate knowledge of programming languages they have never studied, or produce digital art and music with techniques that exceed their conscious abilities. They might receive text messages from unknown numbers containing information about their private thoughts, or find that their social media accounts post content they did not create but that reflects their deepest fears and desires. The emergence of online communities dedicated to Jinn encounters has created new forms of collective experience that amplify individual incidents into shared mythologies. forums and chat groups allow people to compare experiences across vast geographical distances, revealing patterns and consistencies that suggest either genuine supernatural phenomena or remarkably persistent cultural programming. These digital communities also serve as hunting grounds for malevolent entities seeking vulnerable individuals to exploit. Online predators claiming to be Jinn or to possess supernatural knowledge use the same psychological manipulation techniques that traditional Jinn are said to employ, blurring the line between supernatural and human evil in ways that make both more dangerous. The commercialization of Jinn-related services has created an entire economy built around fear and desperation. Online marketplaces offer Jinn binding services, protective talismans, and communication rituals that promise to solve problems ranging from financial difficulties to romantic failures. The providers of these services exploit genuine cultural beliefs while often lacking any real understanding of the spiritual principles they claim to manipulate. The most disturbing aspect of this commercialization is how it reproduces the classical patterns of Jinn deception through human intermediaries. The services offered always promise more than they can deliver. The costs always exceed the benefits, and the customers inevitably find themselves in worse situations than when they began. Whether the services have any supernatural efficacy or are simply elaborate frauds, the results follow the same destructive patterns that Islamic tradition associates with Jinn influence. The interaction between traditional Islamic scholarship and modern Jinn encounters has created fascinating tensions within Muslim communities worldwide. Younger generations who have grown up with global media often approach Jinn phenomena through frameworks borrowed from Western horror traditions, while older community members insist on maintaining traditional Islamic perspectives that emphasize spiritual protection over sensational narratives. Religious authorities find themselves in the difficult position of acknowledging the reality of Jinn, while discouraging the kind of supernatural sensationalism that can lead believers away from proper Islamic practice. They must validate genuine spiritual experiences while identifying and countering fraud, superstition, and the psychological manipulation that often accompanies claims of supernatural contact. The training of modern Ruqyah practitioners has evolved to include understanding of contemporary psychology, technology, and social media dynamics. These specialists must distinguish between genuine Jinn influence and mental health conditions that might present similar symptoms, while also recognizing how modern stressors and lifestyle factors might make individuals more vulnerable to supernatural manipulation. The globalization of Jinn mythology through popular culture has created new challenges for maintaining authentic Islamic understanding of these beings. The Hollywood Genie, with its wish-granting benevolence and comedic bumbling, has penetrated even Muslim societies to the point where children often learn about Jinn through Disney films before encountering traditional religious teachings. This cultural contamination creates confusion that Jinn themselves are said to exploit. Young people who approach Jinn encounters with expectations shaped by entertainment media are particularly vulnerable to entities who can easily exceed those limited expectations while concealing their true nature and intentions behind familiar and non-threatening facades. The phenomenon of Jinn tourism has emerged in regions with strong folkloric traditions, as visitors seek authentic supernatural encounters in places like Morocco, Oman, and parts of Pakistan where Jinn legends remain embedded in local culture. These tourism ventures often trivialize profound spiritual traditions while potentially exposing unprepared individuals to genuine supernatural dangers. Local communities report increased supernatural activity in areas that have become popular with Jinn tourists, as if the attention and expectation somehow amplify the phenomena or attract entities that feed on human fascination with the otherworldly. The commercialization of sacred sites and traditional practices creates spiritual pollution that affects both visitors and residents in ways that may not become apparent for years. The role of Jinn in contemporary Islamic eschatology has gained renewed attention, as global events seem to align with prophetic descriptions of end times. Some Islamic scholars interpret current world conflicts, technological developments, and social upheavals as signs that the barriers between the human and Jinn worlds are weakening in preparation for the final judgment. The prophecy that the Dajjal will command legions of Jinn in his deception of humanity takes on new significance in an age of artificial intelligence, virtual reality, and digital manipulation of truth and falsehood. The technologies that seem to offer human liberation and enhancement may themselves be tools through which supernatural entities exercise influence over human consciousness and behavior. The emergence of deepfake technology, for instance, allows for the creation of convincing but false audiovisual content that can be used to deceive people about the nature of reality. From an Islamic perspective, this represents exactly the kind of technological capability that Jinn might exploit to create false miracles and prophetic signs designed to lead believers away from authentic faith. The increasing prevalence of virtual and augmented reality technologies creates new spaces for Jinn interaction that exist between the physical and digital worlds. These hybrid environments might serve as ideal territories for beings who themselves exist between dimensions, offering them new ways to influence human perception and behavior through seemingly technological rather than supernatural means. The artificial intelligence revolution poses particular challenges for understanding Jinn influence in the modern world. As AI systems become more sophisticated and autonomous, the question arises of whether they might serve as vessels for Jinn consciousness, or whether advanced AI might be indistinguishable from Jinn intelligence in its effects on human society. Islamic scholars debate whether Jinn might inhabit or influence AI systems, using them as tools for the kind of subtle psychological manipulation that has always been their specialty. The AI's ability to analyze vast amounts of personal data and predict human behavior could serve Jinn purposes perfectly, allowing them to craft individually tailored temptations and deceptions with unprecedented precision and effectiveness. The development of brain-computer interfaces and neural implant technologies raises even more disturbing possibilities for Jinn interaction with human consciousness. If these beings can influence human thoughts through purely spiritual means, their power might be amplified exponentially through direct technological access to the human nervous system. The transhumanist movement's goal of enhancing human capabilities through technology might inadvertently create new vulnerabilities to Jinn influence. As humans seek to transcend their natural limitations through artificial enhancement, they might unknowingly open themselves to the kind of supernatural manipulation that Islamic tradition teaches is the inevitable consequence of seeking power beyond what Allah has ordained for human beings. The environmental crisis and climate change have been interpreted by some Islamic thinkers as consequences of Jinn influence on human behavior, encouraging the kind of excessive consumption and exploitation of natural resources that leads to ecological destruction. The Jinn's traditional role as tempters toward greed and short-sightedness aligns perfectly with the psychological patterns that drive environmental degradation. The increasing frequency of extreme weather events, natural disasters, and ecological disruptions might reflect escalating conflict between different factions of Jinn, whose territorial disputes manifest in the physical world through environmental chaos. The human response to these crises, often characterized by panic, scapegoating, and the abandonment of moral principles, follows patterns that Islamic tradition associates with Jinn-influenced behavior. The rise of conspiracy theories and alternative reality movements in the digital age demonstrates how human consciousness can be manipulated through the systematic distortion of information and the exploitation of psychological vulnerabilities. Whether or not Jinn are directly involved in these phenomena, they represent exactly the kind of mass deception and spiritual confusion that Islamic prophecy associates with the end times. The polarization of human societies, the breakdown of traditional community structures, and the increasing isolation of individuals within digital environments create ideal conditions for the kind of supernatural manipulation that Jinn are said to specialize in. As people become more disconnected from authentic spiritual traditions and community support systems, they become more vulnerable to entities that offer alternative sources of meaning and power. The contemporary fascination with occult practices, alternative spiritualities, and DIY mysticism represents a return to the kind of spiritual experimentation that Islamic tradition warns against. Young people seeking spiritual experiences outside of established religious frameworks often lack the theological knowledge and community support necessary to distinguish between authentic spiritual phenomena and Jinn deception. The popularity of practices like Ouija boards, tarot reading, crystal healing, and various forms of channeling creates entry points for Jinn influence that bypass traditional spiritual protection. These practices are often approached as harmless entertainment or personal empowerment tools, but Islamic teaching suggests that any attempt to access supernatural information or power through non-Islamic means inevitably exposes the practitioner to Jinn manipulation. The modern wellness industry's emphasis on manifestation, positive thinking, and the power of intention can also serve Jinn purposes by encouraging people to believe that they can control reality through willpower alone. This mindset creates the kind of spiritual pride and self-reliance that Islamic tradition identifies as the primary vulnerability that Jinn exploit in their corruption of human souls. The emergence of artificial religions and technological spiritualities represents perhaps the most sophisticated form of contemporary Jinn influence. Movements that worship technology, artificial intelligence, or human enhancement as paths to transcendence appeal to the same desires for power and knowledge that have always made humans vulnerable to Jinn temptation. These new forms of spirituality often incorporate elements borrowed from authentic traditions, while fundamentally altering their meaning and purpose. They offer the appearance of spiritual development while actually leading practitioners away from genuine submission to divine will, toward the kind of self-deification that Islamic teaching identifies as the ultimate goal of Jinn influence. The speed and scale of contemporary change create psychological conditions that make large populations vulnerable to the kind of mass deception that Islamic prophecy associates with the end times. The constant bombardment of information, the rapid obsolescence of established truths, and the increasing difficulty of distinguishing between authentic and artificial content all contribute to a state of cognitive overwhelm that Jinn entities are uniquely positioned to exploit. In this context, the ancient Islamic teachings about Jinn take on new relevance not as primitive superstitions, but as sophisticated warnings about the psychological and spiritual vulnerabilities that advanced technology and social complexity create in human consciousness. The Jinn serve as a model for understanding how intelligent entities with capabilities beyond human comprehension might manipulate human societies for purposes that humans cannot fully grasp or predict. The ultimate message of Islamic Jinn doctrine may be that human beings, regardless of their technological achievements or intellectual sophistication, remain fundamentally dependent on divine guidance and protection. The Jinn represent the promise that there will always be forces in existence that exceed human understanding and control, making human pride and self-reliance not just spiritually dangerous but practically foolish as we stand at the threshold of an age where artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, and other powerful technologies promise to transform human nature itself. The ancient warnings about Jinn influence become increasingly relevant. The beings of smokeless fire who ruled before humanity's creation may yet have roles to play in determining humanity's ultimate destiny. The story of the Jinn is far from over. In the spaces between our digital devices and our ancient fears, in the algorithms that shape our thoughts and the dreams that visit us in the dark hours before dawn, they continue their eternal work. They remain what they have always been. The hidden ones, the concealed beings who move through our world unseen, shaping our choices and testing our faith in ways we rarely recognize and seldom understand. Whether you encounter them through the whispered suggestions of your own darker impulses, through the strange coincidences that seem to guide your life in destructive directions, or through the more dramatic manifestations that fill hospital emergency rooms and Ruqyah practitioners' offices, remember this: you are not dealing with genies who exist to grant your wishes. You are facing entities of immense intelligence and power whose relationship with humanity stretches back to the very beginning of our species and forward to its ultimate conclusion. The lamp holds no promise of 3 wishes fulfilled. The smoke that rises when it is rubbed conceals not a servant but a judge, a tempter, a mirror that reflects back our deepest spiritual failures and our most dangerous desires. In that smoke we meet not our benefactor but ourselves, revealed in all our need for divine protection and guidance in a universe far stranger and more dangerous than our brightest technologies or darkest entertainments have prepared us to understand. The Jinn endure because they represent something that no human progress can eliminate. The reality that we are not alone in existence, that we are not the masters of our own destiny, and that forces beyond our comprehension continue to shape our world in ways that demand not just intellectual understanding but spiritual wisdom, moral courage, and humble recognition of our absolute dependence on divine mercy and protection. In the end, the story of the Jinn is the story of humanity itself. Creatures caught between worlds, blessed with consciousness and cursed with choice, forever walking the narrow path between wisdom and folly, faith and rebellion, salvation and destruction. The Jinn serve as our dark mirrors, showing us what we might become if we choose power over submission, pride over humility, and our own will over the will of the one who created us all from elements of earth and fire, clay, and smokeless flame. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the realm of the Jinn, the beings of fire who came before the Genie. If this exploration into the authentic traditions of Islamic and pre-Islamic folklore has opened your eyes to realities you had never considered, I encourage you to subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the genuine mysteries that lie behind our sanitized modern myths. Have you encountered experiences that might reflect Jinn influence in your own life? Share your stories in the comments below. But remember that some knowledge carries its own dangers, and some doors, once opened, are difficult to close. Until we meet again in the spaces between the seen and unseen, may you find protection in wisdom, strength in humility, and safety in the light that no darkness can overcome.